Welcome everybody to today's latest installment of Savas Labs Client-Side Chat series. We're going to be walking through our workshop on user research for successful web projects. So let's get started. If today is your first time going through client-side chats, I'd love to be able to introduce that to you here in the next slide. Client-side chats provide a platform for Savas Labs and our clients to showcase the ways in which we've collaborated together, but ultimately to share our industry knowledge and expertise to help people like yourselves learn about new technologies and tactics to support their organizations, understand the processes and maybe the pitfalls within implementing those, and really build a network of like-minded professionals who are looking to make an impact using technology. So let's talk a little bit about what today is going to be all about. Our workshop is going to cover some of the basics of what user-first design is and how that connects with our topic of user research. We're going to go into some of those research methods, talk about when to best apply those and how to do so. And then we are going to be answering your questions about user research methods and their roles within successful digital projects, maybe specifically towards yours. But first, let me introduce Savas Labs. Savas Labs is a highly skilled team of designers, developers, and consultants that build digital products that create meaningful impact. We are based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, but we are spread across the entire United States and even the entire globe at this point. And we love being able to talk about all the technical aspects of web projects, whether that's from the user experience and design side of things to the technical development of web projects, whether that's websites or applications. So let's talk a little bit about who we are going to be covering here today and what we're going to be doing. So first off, I'd love to be able to introduce our panelists for today. And first is Justin Wayman. He is a senior digital product manager at Share Our Strength, which, as you all will learn, is the larger overall organization with No Kid Hungry. We're going to give Justin his own section to be able to introduce himself and his organization. So let me move on here now to the Savas Labs team. Simon Goodwin is the senior UX designer here at Savas Labs. And with him is Sean O'Shea, our lead UX design strategist. Both of these people are absolutely experts within their field on the user experience side of things, and they have a ton that they are ready to share with you here today. And me, myself, I'm Mark Hirschberger. I'm the growth director here at Savas Labs. I'm really here just to intro and outro everybody, but I'm going to get out of the way here soon enough to let the smart people talk. And let's learn a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start off today's workshop going through what project brought us in here today that gave us the idea to be able to share this information with you. We are then going to start with some foundational aspects of user-first design, talking a little bit about how we approach just design in general and how that affects user research. We're then going to go into a handful of user research methods, starting with analytics audits, going into user and stakeholder surveys, as well as user and stakeholder interviews. And we're going to wrap up today with talking about how to build and present your findings in a way that showcases what you learned, as well as gets buy-in on what you maybe want to do with that information. We will be finishing off today with questions from the audience. So if you have any questions about just any of these research methods, whether that's coming into today's workshop or during that, please feel free to use Zoom and use that Q&A section to put those questions in there. We will be batching all of those for the end of today's workshop. So just know that we will be getting to them at the end. So throw those in whenever you need. Another note as well, if you're running into any technical issues, please feel free to use the chat on the inside of Zoom here. We will be able to just work with you. We have technical support to make sure that you get the information you need. All right, let's move into today's actual conversation, though. I would love to be able to bring in Justin. Justin, could you maybe introduce yourself a little bit about your role, about the organizations that you work with, and what maybe brought us here today?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Like Mark said, I'm Justin Wayman. I'm the Senior Digital Product Manager at Share Our Strength, which is a national organization devoted to fighting hunger and poverty. In my current role, I oversee the strategy and development for more than 50 Share Our Strength web properties, and I've worked in various roles within nonprofit and higher education comms departments in Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania for about 20 years now. Share Our Strength's most well-known program, as Mark mentioned, is the No Kid Hungry campaign. which was launched in 2010. And it has helped ensure that 3 million more children were eating breakfast each day at school. It's helped secure child nutrition program waivers that let millions of kids get access to healthy meals wherever they're learning. Before the pandemic, we helped bring child hunger to its lowest point in more than 50 years. And during the pandemic alone, we responded to the need that we saw when kids were out of school and parents were losing their jobs by distributing more than $100 million in grants to local schools, food banks, community organizations to help feed kids during the pandemic. A large but less visible part of No Kid Hungry is our Center for Best Practices, which is our policy shop that produces reports and data that inform our recommendations for eliminating child hunger altogether. The CBP, as we call it, is instrumental in establishing and implementing pandemic EBT, which is a public benefit during the coronavirus pandemic that replaced the cost of lost school meals. They also provided training resources to tens of thousands of school nutrition staff, community nonprofits, government officials to help them adopt effective and innovative ways to feed kids. The problem is the CBP's web presence is hosted on a subdomain that is separate from the main No Kid Hungry site, and it's been rife with problems since it was built about 5 years ago. It was built and launched by a vendor who essentially ghosted themselves at the end of the project. We weren't able to contact them to get improvements made. They were just gone. So we were left holding a semi-complete website that was not easy to update or maintain. Users complained about not being able to easily find what they're looking for. Internal stakeholders obviously frustrated by the difficulty around making minor edits to the site structure. So knowing that change was necessary, and this has been over the last couple of years, knowing that change was necessary and that nonprofit budgets are always limited, we knew we needed to make a strong case for building a new site and the investment that would entail. The CBP team had a modest line in their budget for general web improvements. So we decided to use that to engage with a vendor to generate a discovery doc, which would hopefully provide us with the evidence and support that we would need to secure a larger investment in the following year's budget. After talking to multiple vendors, we decided to engage in a discovery phase with Savas Labs, which is why we're here today. And this was based on their experience working with similar resource-heavy orgs and institutions, as well as their background as a Drupal shop, which is where the CBP site is currently hosted. I know that's not all they do, but that was an added plus for us. We recently completed this discovery work and we're able to successfully convince leadership to invest in this property. And we just recently kicked into the design phase for our new site. So this process worked for us. We were able to get what we wanted, both from Savas Labs and from our internal team. And we're really excited to begin the next couple phases of this project. So I'll kick it over to Sean, who will dive, I think, into the tools and tactics that we utilize for this project.
Yeah. And thanks, Justin, so much for covering that. Some of the folks on this call might be wondering, why are we going into so much detail on this very specific project? And one of the main reasons, folks, is that we wanted to make sure that during this workshop, we gave you something real world to be able to compare some of the lessons and some of the directions we're giving and see how it actually comes to life. So a note here is that we use this project, the Center for Best Practices with No Kid Hungry, within this workshop to give you those examples. And because of that, we're only going to be focusing on the research methods that we used during that project. So y'all should have a workbook that is associated with this workshop sent to you earlier this week. There are a handful of other research methods within there that we won't be covering today, but no worries. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. We will be giving you contact information on that. But just know that that is going to be our focus here today, making sure you've got some real life examples. So with that, I am going to hand over that baton to Sean O'Shea. He is going to give you some foundational aspects that you should be considering throughout this entire process. Sean, take it away.
Hi, I'm Sean. I'm our lead user experience researcher here at Savas Labs. I've been doing UX design for about 10 years and was very excited to be able to work with Justin and the No Kid Hungry folks on this. Before we start talking about the specific research methods that we used in the discovery phase with them, I wanted to just quickly give kind of a foundational groundwork of what user-first design is and how UX research fits within that. So user-first design, as you can probably tell by the name, is the practice of putting the user at the center of all decisions you make around features, functionality, even visual design approach for your website, app, or other digital project. To do this well, you have to understand your users. And there's really two parts of this. The first is understanding these kind of general truths about humans, the way that we perceive information, the way that we navigate an environment, the way we forage for the next bit of content that we're looking for. And there's a lot of great research already done out there kind of about these general truths. But the other half is really understanding your users specifically. What are their needs and goals? What are their frustrations? What assumptions do they bring with them to the table, whether they're correct or incorrect? What impression they get of you, the things they take away from interacting with your organization, brand, company. And to understand that, you have to kind of conduct your own research. And that's what user research is that combination of different methods that you use to understand your specific audiences. As Mark said, there's lots of research methods out there. We're just going to be covering the ones that we worked with the No Kid Hungry team on, but the other ones should be detailed in that workbook. So one of the first places we started was with an analytics audit. And analytics audits are sort of analysis of the bulk traffic through a website or an app, normally through Google Analytics or something like Hotjar. It's great for answering questions like, where are users coming from? What pages do they enter through? What sections of the site are visited most? Even from, what percentage of visitors to page A make it to page B? Those kinds of questions. And it gathers quantitative data as opposed to qualitative, which we'll talk about in a second. So quantitative data is all numbers-based, it's statistics. It's great for discovering trends. It's not great for discovering the reasons behind those trends, or sort of the why about certain things. But again, we chose it to start off a discovery project with No Kid Hungry just because it's a great way to get the lay of the land. You sort of pop the hood on your existing website or app and better understand how people are using it. And the best thing about it is it generates a lot of questions for you to then pursue in other research methods. It's less about answering questions and more about honing in on what questions you should continue to ask. So for the Center for Best Practices site, we started looking at anomalies that existed. Where's the data an outlier? We looked at general trends of where people are coming from and where they're going. But then another great thing about analytics is you can use it to probe assumptions and hunches. And the No Kid Hungry team had a hunch about one of the main sections of their site. They have 3 main sections of their site. One of them is this playbook section, which sort of has resources for different types of people performing different kinds of advocacy. So information for policymakers about how they can improve child hunger resources in schools, or school administrators. So it's these sectioned groups of resources for people involved in advocacy. But the hunch that the No Kid Hungry team had was that, maybe this is not getting a whole lot of traffic. So that was something we could look into very directly with an analytics audit. So in kind of parsing through that data, we looked at the sessions coming to the site, and a session is a visit that consists of 1 or more pages. So it's not page views, it's just a visit to the site. And of all of the visits to the site, only 3% touched on any of the sections or any of the pages within the playbook section, which definitely kind of quickly confirmed that section was low traffic. But another thing we looked at is, of those sessions that went to that main playbook page, how many continued into deeper pages within that same section? And we've got 3% going into playbook, and then less than half of those even continuing deeper into those subpages. And again, the analytics can't really tell us why that's happening, but we can make some guesses. And an interesting thing about this section is thinking about it in the terms of a user research kind of analogy that's called information foraging. And that's where you tie the idea of how people look for information in a website to how animals forage for food, in a forest. And it's the principles there are that people will be content to follow a trail of clues as long as they know they're on the right path. And what our guess here is that the word playbook didn't really have a strong clue, didn't really have strong information sent for people to understand what that what that section contained. And then also looking at this data, we saw that the people who did kind of decide to explore that section got to that main page, didn't see anything they were interested in, and then pulled back out. But again, these are just guesses about that based on the trends. I'm curious, Justin, what were your reactions to this, and especially as regard to the assumptions that your team had?
Yeah, I mean, I think for some of us, these findings proved our assumptions correct. I think a lot of us internally, kind of knew that sections like playbook and other areas of the site were problematic for users. I think the problem that we run into, and that I would guess that a large portion of the listeners on this call, if they're working on small nonprofit teams or small teams at organizations, is that hunches and guesses aren't going to get your leadership to give you the money that you need to make the investment. So, and sometimes the people who are making the decisions were people who were around when these decisions on terminology and taxonomy were made on your site. So in this case, the person who was most attached to the term playbook and what was included underneath it is the person who decided whether or not we were going to get the money to redo the site. So by providing this type of information and challenging their assumptions, but also validating ours, it was invaluable to make the case for further investment. And I think this is just one example. I think that there's plenty of areas on our sites that the analytics audit that Sean and his team did helped provide us with a clear direction on where we need to go with the future development.
Cool. Yeah, and again, it really uncovers the trends. We can guess at the why, but in order to really understand that, we have to combine this quantitative research method with other research methods, which brings us to the concept of surveys. And I'll pass it over to Simon to talk about that.
Thanks, Sean. Hey, everyone. I'm Simon. I'm a senior UX designer and strategist here at Savas. And yeah, I helped with this project, helping out with a lot of these research methods. So for No Kids Hungry, one of the methods that we decided to use was surveys. Surveys are just generally a quick and easy way to gather multiple types of data. Sean's already mentioned it a couple of times, but it can be flexible in how you use it and what type of questions you ask, because it can be used to gather both quantitative and qualitative data. If you ask a lot of closed-ended questions, you end up with a lot more quantitative data, but you can actually use a lot of open-ended questions where people have to write out their responses, and you can gather a lot more qualitative data. So we chose surveys for No Kids Hungry for actually both of those reasons. We chose to do two different surveys. One of them was a user survey, which we asked a lot of closed-ended questions to gather this type of quantitative data that you're seeing here on this screen. So a lot of it's good for demographic and quick preferential data here. In this case, we got to understand a lot more about who was coming to the NKH website and just kind of like where demographically they were, if they were policymakers or if they worked at a school or nonprofit, things like that. So that was great, and just kind of strengthening some of these assumptions that the analytics audit brought with us. But what we still were missing was kind of the why around some of these things. So the other survey that we utilized was a stakeholder survey. This was sent out to a large handful of internal NKH employees and stakeholders that knew a lot about this website. We asked a lot of open-ended questions, giving them the freedom to really kind of spell out some of their thoughts. Again, this is kind of more preferential data of what's working, what's not working, things like that. But using a stakeholder survey is really nice because it allows us to reach a lot more internal folks to get a little bit wider audience internally, but also helping all of the internal clients feel like they are part of this as well. And then when you have that bigger collective voice internally, that can kind of strengthen some of the momentum that some of these like analytics audits or other data is kind of showing. So, Justin, I'm going to bring it around to you with kind of showing up, being able to show off the analytics data as well as the user survey data, and then kind of bringing in a lot of the stakeholder questions that were a little bit more detailed. How did all of this information that we started to gather help kind of make a case for some of these updates?
Yeah, I think the surveys, particularly the internal surveys where we allowed the CBP team, which just for context, it's a fairly large team within our organization, probably 25 to 30 people on their team, and lots of people who aren't necessarily plugged into the conversation about the website. But this surveys gave them an opportunity, no matter how junior or senior they were, to let their opinion be heard and considered on the same level as somebody in leadership that's been there for 10 years. I think it also, in the same realm of providing evidence to leadership, when you're provided a document that has more than 50% of your team complaining about a specific area of the site or expressing concern about the difficulty of navigating, then I think if you didn't think that it was a problem previously, you probably do now, and you get a little higher sense of urgency to act. So I think it gave both buy-in capabilities, but also allowed people to feel like their voice is being heard, even if they're not necessarily involved in the day-to-day of this project or even day-to-day of the website. They still are able to make their opinions felt. And oftentimes, somebody maybe is working at a lower level. They feel like their opinion doesn't really matter, but it's still an opinion that you're a person who's representing the organization or you're working in the site. We gather it, and like I said, it's sort of considered at the same level, and makes everybody sort of being existing on an even playing field, in addition to providing that evidence for buy-in. So I think it was useful in two different regards there.
Looks like we maybe forgot about the mute button there.
Great call. I always forget about the mute button. So we used the surveys to gather both quantitative and qualitative data, but another way that we gathered even more qualitative data was through user interviews. So user interviews are a much more casual conversation with specific people that utilize the CBP website. So Sean and I talked to 3 different folks, and we asked them questions, very open-ended questions, such as like, what do you do for a living with the CBP website? How do you normally visit the site? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you find most valuable? These open-ended questions that start a conversation, but it's different than the survey in that it allows us to continue that conversation and continue to ask, well, why do you do it that way? And then so we generally start off with a set of starter questions. We never expect it to be just these questions. We generally kind of figure that we might even only get to half of these questions, but we get to dig in a lot deeper into the why around their thought process, what their actual process is, why they're doing what they're doing, what they're thinking as they're doing this stuff. So yeah, we chose to do these in order to gain that much deeper understanding around some of these core users that use this site a lot. And yeah, so Justin, how did this kind of data help even more when it came to kind of selling?
Yeah, and I think it's a continuation of the previous method. So for these interviews, you're talking directly to key partners of ours who utilize the site frequently and rely on the site for their work. So, just like any consumer brand, wants to know how to improve their product, they're going to talk to the people who use the product. They're not going to just rely on data alone. They want to know how the people are using the product. So same thing, I think, with our site, hearing directly from people who, again, I keep going back to leadership, but they're ultimately the ones who, turn the faucet on or off for us. If they know a lot of times they know the people that were being interviewed personally, they work with them frequently, that opinion is going to be weighted, So I think it's just another layer on top of the previous methods that allow us to both, get a better understanding. I think I'm a little bit of an outlier within the organization because I do know the site so well. So I know, I'm totally in tune with the Savvis team and what they're producing. There hasn't been a result that I have been surprised by, but it does, for those who are only, tangentially involved with the site, it opens their eyes. I think there's a tendency to, just have blinders on, just assume that everything's working because, you're not hearing about, donations being dropped or, the site being hacked. So everything's fine, right? But whenever you get this information put in front of you, it really ups that urgency and it makes it clear that if we want our users to take away what we want them to take away, to implement change in their communities, to advocate for new policies on the Hill, we need to make it as easy as possible for them to access that information, which we clearly are not doing currently. So by layering these different pieces together, we were able to make it clear that the situation is urgent, that we need to do it quickly. We can't wait just to do piecemeal changes. We had attempted to do some little facelift type things, but ultimately we just needed to untangle the whole knot and relace the sneaker, which this process and the data that Simon and Sean and the team have put together sped that process up by a magnitude of half a year, probably, just to get the ball rolling and get that investment at this key time, because our budget is fiscal year July 1 to June 30th. So we were in the spring as we were engaging on this. So it was urgent that we got this information and they delivered it quickly, and we were able to get that line in the budget for next year and keep this project moving rather than sort of pushing pause and waiting until next year. So all these things added up to making it a clear choice for us.
I think piggybacking off of that, just as you were saying, like making sure that people can quickly find all this information. For folks that are not familiar with it, the Center for Best Practices site is just this massive repository of super valuable information for various different audiences. One of the really, I think, powerful anecdotes that we got out of the user interviews that we were just talking about is there was one individual who works with a lot of different school districts and provides them with resources, sort of like a go-between between No Kid Hungry, the Center for Best Practices, and the individual school districts. And one thing that we heard from them that was super powerful was the fact that this person downloaded all the resources as PDFs and used their own organization system on their computer because it was easier than navigating the website to find that thing again. And it's just little anecdotes like that that are just aha moments that catalyze consensus and momentum around, just as Justin was saying, hey, we need to fix this. We need to invest time and effort into this because fixing this will help us achieve our mission and achieve greater impact and at such a higher degree. So that's really the power of combining both qualitative and quantitative research methods. The quantitative really helps you understand the trends. It gets you the data. The qualitative gets you those really powerful anecdotes that speak much more loudly than, pie charts and graphs and statistics. And when it comes to putting together all of those insights, especially if you're doing user research with multiple different methods, like that presentation is, as you know, very critical. You've invested all this time and effort into doing the research. Now you've got to present it in a compelling way to create that momentum internally to kind of build on these findings and take action. The strongest way that we found to present these findings is, instead of presenting them method by method by method, presenting them by insight and using, hey, we discovered this about the website. Here's evidence from analytics, here's evidence from moderated user testing, here's information from user surveys that all back up that insight. So if you think back to the analytics example that we started with, we had the trends in the graphs, but then we also had the survey data to back that up, and always combining those really makes a very salient case for making that change and running with that. And thinking back to kind of that presentation we had with your team, Justin, were there any moments of that? I feel like you did a great job of laying everything out in what you just said, but there were any moments of that presentation that you feel like were especially helpful?
I think just, tying it all together, and I think just the recommendations in general, honestly, a lot of times I think what I've noticed in, my career at nonprofits and at academic institutions is that leadership will often trust outside voices more than they'll trust the internal folks on their team, which is frustrating. But, I think there's some psychology at work there. That, if you pay for something from somebody that does that every day, that opinion is more valuable. And, in every sense, in the putting the document and the presentation together is not something we had the capacity or the expertise to do internally. So having your team put that together in such a complete package and then make clear recommendations on next steps, I think was the icing on the cake. I don't think it was as much of an uphill push as it seemed that it was going to be at the beginning, because of the process that we established, where you're talking to people, where we're reporting out to our team about where the process is and what the findings are. So it's sort of a drip, drip, drip kind of thing, where people are sort of getting the hint that, all right, this sounds like this is a little more urgent. And then the presentation just sort of hits them like, all right, now's the time to act. And it was delivered in a way that wasn't overly technical and doesn't make it unapproachable for folks who are not quote unquote web savvy. So yeah, I think it's just the tying a bow on all the stuff that allowed us to get a signature on the final budget.
Wonderful. Thank you, Justin, for kind of giving that client perspective in terms of how some of those elements come together to help you make that case, right? And dealing with some of the internal psychological aspects of needing some of those elements. So I want to spend
one thing I just wanted to add real quick. And, I think the other valuable thing to producing a document like this is that oftentimes what happens, at least in my world with projects, is it's completed, you move on to the next project, and you forget what happened, or documentation wasn't created, or it just gets lost in the previous person's inbox and it's just lost forever. So by having this documentation and putting it in a place where it's shareable, we use Asana for our project management internally. So we have a place for this project where we just drop this document. Now we can go back and refer to it, 3 or 4 years from now, whenever we have questions about the audience, or, what did we find whenever we did that analytics research. And I think it'll be especially helpful after we launch the new site to be able to go back and look at the previous assumptions and continue to iterate, so that we don't get, 5 years down the road and realize that, we wanted to change something or initially, so it becomes an iterative process. And, hopefully you identify good partners like we have with Savas, where you can continue a relationship after the project is launched. So the ghosting doesn't happen like we experienced before. And if there is a 2.0 or continued enhancements that you want to make, you've got people who are intimately involved with the project who can come on board and help out. So I think that I don't want to just focus on getting buy-in from leadership, because I feel like that's what I've been talking about a lot in my world. That is the heavy lift a lot of times. But I think just for looking down the road, sometimes we just get focused on the present and we don't have the time to really look back at what happened. So by having these types of documents, I just think it's an invaluable resource that you can use whenever new people come on, in leadership, or whenever, they're wondering, why did we do this? So I think that's some added benefits to processes and having that finished document at the end.
Definitely. Yeah. Documentation is going to be key, right? You're not paying for the presentation of that document necessarily, but also just the use and the information that's provided that goes well beyond that time. So speaking of time, we have a little bit of time here on the backside, and I'd like for us to spend that time as a group here going through a couple areas from our workshop that we could maybe dive a little bit deeper into to give some insights for our attendees here today. One of the things that I'd love to be able to tackle here that I think a lot of people are interested in is going to be focused on what would you give as advice to anybody who's taking on one of these research methods for maybe the first time? So I'd love to start at the top with our analytics audit. Sean, Simon, Justin as well. Throw in anything that, if you were to maybe speak to your younger self or any UX researcher out there starting an analytics audit for the first time, what would some of that advice look like?
I think starting with analytics, but this is definitely a universal thing about user research and really any research, is bias is really dangerous. And we always come to everything with our own biases, whether we're aware of them or not. And especially with analytics, it's easy to find ways to have the data support your assumptions, the things you want it to tell you. So that's a really key thing about doing any user research method, is being aware of those biases, finding ways of circumventing them, and really allowing the data to tell you what the truth is rather than what you want it to tell you. And then, as we talked about specifically for analytics, it's really easy to draw conclusions from data and trends that you see, but most of that is born out of bias of, hey, we see this trend, so that means X. But answering the question of why is much more difficult. And alongside of that, it's easy to think of trends as bad or good depending on the situation, but sometimes you can be wrong about that, or have the actual ramification be the opposite. I'm thinking of a news website that we worked on a while back, which was a large news outlet that had stories going back for 20 years. One of the things they looked at their own analytics regularly, and one of the things they thought they had was an underperforming homepage, because compared to the other pages in their site, their homepage almost got no traffic. So they thought that that was a problem and they needed to find a way to fix that. In digging into that more and thinking about the context of a news website, a low traffic homepage is actually a sign of a healthy website, because we really want those articles to have strong SEO and to be shared. So if people are engaging with your articles, especially if they're on social media or if they're searching for certain topics, that's going to make your homepage have a lot less traffic in comparison to that. So always be cautious about jumping to conclusions about what the data is telling you, especially with analytics.
That's awesome. So user first design, human first design needs to also take into account the human on the other side of that analysis, right? Making sure you're checking your biases. And then I also heard from there, making sure that you are looking for context alongside the trends that you're seeing, and creating a truly informed decision based off of that. Simon, it sounded like you had something as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I have some friends that are also in a similar field, and it seems like sometimes it's hard to sell your company on maybe even performing user research, because a lot of times there's that upfront cost. But I was just gonna say that moving forward in a project without doing your research is kind of like taking a shot in the dark. There's a chance you might hit the target, but more than likely, you're not even going to be close. Whereas doing the research is kind of like both turning on the lights and actually taking the time to aim, so that you have a much more defined target and you know what you're aiming at. So then you know what to do in order to actually fix your problem. So sometimes there is that bit of an upfront cost, but it's worth it because, like I said, you're taking the aim, you know what your problem is at that point. So that was all I was going to chime in.
No, I love that. Justin, putting you on the spot here a little bit, but I would imagine that an analytics audit is something that, from a client side, maybe you're a bit more familiar with being dug in on those metrics on a regular basis. What would you say for somebody who's maybe, on the client side of things, is an important thing to look at when considering that audit from an analytics perspective.
I think the advantage that you have when you're the owner of the site is you know what your site's goals are, you know who your site's audience is, and not every metric is the same depending on the goal of your site. So sort of like what Sean said about, some sites, homepage traffic isn't the most important thing. When I look at some of our sites, so I regularly look at analytics for our sites. Some of them have higher bounce rates than others. If it was our main site, and had a bounce rate of 75%, I'd be concerned. But perhaps it's on a site where we don't have it's more of a brochure site that doesn't have a clear CTA, and we're just trying to, promote a texting service or something like that, where the bounce rate doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot. We just want people to literally just see the page. That's a different level of analysis, I think. So I think internally, just knowing your own audience and the goals for your site when determining what's important, and sort of what Simon mentioned is putting the context around the analytics is tricky, because if you're just looking at it as just a random site that you don't have any ties to, you would evaluate the data a lot differently than something that a lot more intimately. Like, that you're pushing people to this subpage, so it's not, sort of to Sean's point, it's not a big deal if you're not getting a ton of traffic to the homepage. So I think that, the first step, if you're managing a site at a smaller organization, is make sure that you've got Google Analytics installed, and then just getting to know your environment and, establish a baseline. I've got a shared Excel file that I have all of our sites where I track traffic either biweekly or monthly, so that we can identify trends, and that will alert us, as I think, sort of to Guy's question in the chat, that there might be a problem. If we're seeing alarmingly high bounce rates on our homepage and people aren't donating, or they're not signing up for a newsletter, or they're not signing up for fundraisers, then we probably need to reevaluate what we're serving up to the audiences when they get there. So I think getting to know your own environment is important first before you can really engage with a vendor, because, and I'm not saying this is what Savvis will do, but some vendors will just sort of tell you what they'll back up the assumptions that you're putting forward. I don't think Savvis has done that. I think the assumptions that myself and my partner Chelsea have made were backed up by Savvis Labs, but I do think that what they provided opened eyes that weren't regularly used to the site. But because Chelsea and I knew the site fairly well, we had a pretty good grasp on what the necessary changes were, and we were able to find a company like Savvis that could work with us to get buy-in on that change. So get to know your sites, make sure you've got Google Analytics plugged in. All the Google properties are great for managing your site. Google Tag Manager makes it easy for you to insert certain code snippets. And then once you identify, where your shortcomings are, I think then it's a good time to engage with a vendor. But by building up that evidence, then you can go to your leadership and you can speak authoritatively on it and make the case for a larger investment.
Look at that, Justin. 2 questions, 1 answer, hit them all there. Guy, looks like that was maybe that first bit. I'm seeing you put a question here now. We'll get into that in just a second. But as I read through Guy's question, I want to pose another to the group here, which is going to be more on the user and the stakeholder survey side of things. Similar question to before. If you're speaking to somebody who's just taking on their first set of user or stakeholder surveys for their project, what are some pieces of advice that you would give them?
I was going to say that oftentimes it's really good to start with analytics first, because that gives you kind of some grounds to start with for the types of questions to maybe ask for a user survey. Again, user surveys are, if you think you might know what the problem is, that's a fairly cheap and easy way to get the ball rolling there. We used SurveyMonkey for both of our surveys. It's generally not super expensive to get that ball rolling. So even if you wanted to try multiple surveys, it just takes sometimes a little bit of time and practice, but also kind of figuring out what the right questions to ask are, or how to adequately ask those questions. It's not something we really got into before, but there's almost like a UX to designing surveys. because as you're trying to send a survey out that's hopefully going to be answered by maybe 100 or 1,000 people or something like that, you have to have pretty short survey with pretty short, easy to think about answers. So we used, like I said, I used the word closed-ended earlier. So a lot of multiple choice or yes, no questions, maybe rankings and stuff like that. But it's not creating a lot of thought process, because it's going to keep it nice and short. So you're going to get more answers out of that.
Yeah, definitely. So considering not only what questions you're looking to ask, right, but also how you're going to ask those and how you're going to make sure that you, just like you would with a website, maintain the right level of attention and focus without maybe losing some of that with too long of questions or too long of lists of questions. Justin, I'm curious again from the client side of things, is there anything that you recognized and noticed within the user or stakeholder surveys within your project that you think would be a really interesting thing for maybe somebody else who's looking to bring in somebody like Savas Labs to run those? Anything that they should know about or consider to prepare their team or prepare yourself?
Well, I think, the biggest benefit to having a dev shop like Savas conduct those surveys and interviews is capacity. I think if you're a potential client on this call and you're working at a nonprofit or academic institution or other similarly constructed workplace, you don't have a lot of time to put together a survey, let alone, analyze the results and then figure out what that means, making sure that it's distributed to the right people. I think for part of the survey, Simon, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we did a light box on the website to allow users to submit responses. But I think, again, for me on my side, it comes back to either validating or disproving assumptions or generating that buy-in from leadership, while also ensuring that it's not added capacity on me or an added workload on me and my team when we're already, stretched thin as it is. So yeah, I think that, it's always easier to have somebody else do your work for you. And especially whenever it's folks who are well-trained in this and they do it, every day for their job rather than, trying to band-aid it yourself. I think it is possible if you're, I don't want to take potential business away from Savas, but I think if you're at a small organization, you can do some of this stuff yourself, but you're going to be missing that expertise from analysis and contextual comparisons and, just doing the work, just compiling and figuring out what the right questions to ask are. So I think having all that done for us and then the evidence that provided was extremely beneficial.
I'm seeing a couple of questions from folks that are getting into UX design in the chat, both from Crystal and Ryan. Ryan asking about, should you study data science or data analytics, and Crystal talking about their experience as an anthropology degree holder. And I think that's the cool thing about UX design is that there's so many different pathways into it. There's the sociology side of things, anthropology, I got into it through graphic design. There's the data science side of things. I think really it boils down to, and the only key ingredient is just curiosity about the way people perceive and use things. And whatever path brings you to UX design, I think that's the most fulfilling thing about it, is using your strengths from that path, but then being exposed to so many different ways of thinking about the same problems. I'd love to go back and get a data science degree, and I may do that at some point. It'd be really cool to get a sociology degree, anthropology. All of that is super informative to the way that you design for humans.
Quick chiming in real quick, just so that we know, especially for these kind of folks. But Sean, what is your degree?
Yeah, so I have a fine arts degree in graphic design.
And I was an animation major. So neither of us have data science degrees, but we're both very curious people. So curiosity is key.
Okay, so one last section that we had discussed earlier on within our workshop was the user and the stakeholder interviews. right? There's a big difference when it comes to putting together a survey that you can send out to multiple people, and maybe you're not face to face and interacting with them, and maybe it's saving them a bit of time. But as you start to get into more of that face to face, the more of that time spent with each person or maybe smaller groups, what are some things that y'all have learned through your experiences that are worth sharing with the people here today when it comes to just running a really sound user or stakeholder interview?
Yeah, I think user interviews, stakeholder interviews, focus groups also falls into that bucket. There, it's always being able to think on your feet and coming into it with a list of questions that you want to pursue. But then, as Simon mentioned during the presentation, being able to pick up the thread on certain things and dig deeper. That's where you really get the powerful anecdotes that can really affect change in the way that you are going to proceed with the project. For instance, that talking with the user interviews for the Center for Best Practices, and that example of the person that downloaded PDFs, that started from a question just about a standard preconceived question of how do you use the website, how do you find resources, and then just picking up on hints and hearing the frustration in that person's voice and digging deeper on that led us to that revelation. So that's really the key for any kind of conversational user research, is just being able to keep that conversation natural, and rather than kind of going one by one through questions, and always digging deeper.
I would add to that, the other half is learning how to just wrangle people and ideas. Oftentimes, if you ask the right question, they might go down a tangent that lasts 15 or 20 minutes, but oftentimes we only have maybe 45 minutes to an hour with this person. So if it starts to get into like a venting session or completely off topic, oftentimes it's our job to tactfully readjust course and back into something that's helpful. So, and that I've found that to just kind of take practice. It's going to happen, but it just takes practice and practice, more practice.
Yeah, everybody maybe has their own agenda for that interview, and it's up to you to make sure that you stay with your agenda to achieve your overall goal, huh? Great. Justin, again, last time I asked you this on today's call, but from a client side of things, who maybe is responsible for getting people set up with some of these interviews, was there anything that you learned through this experience that's worth sharing with anybody who might be working with Savas Labs or just internally in setting these interviews up and running it?
You know, I think the biggest thing for me was sort of getting to know the team and their roles a little better. This probably doesn't affect the project much, but you know, by trying to figure out who the right people are to have the conversations, you learn a little bit more about the teams that you're working with. You know, when you're in a large organization, sometimes that's just the team that sits over there and you don't really hear from them too much. And then by talking to them and getting them set up and explaining the project and the process, it allows me just to gather more information internally for what the needs for the site are. So the more people that you talk to who touch the site, who have a stake in the site, I think you learn more about what the site should be built to do. Or you may learn about audiences that you didn't know existed. Maybe this person communicates directly with school cafeteria workers associations or something like that we didn't know were main focal audiences, that then when we go into our workshops with the core project team and Savas, we can talk about, oh, well, we actually heard that this was maybe not a priority audience, but something we want to consider. So I think it just adds some personal knowledge building when you are engaging on just getting the groundwork laid for this internally by talking to the people who are directly involved. If it's not a site that that you are the sole owner of, if it's something that lots of people touch, there's likely things that you don't know about it. So by having those conversations and seeing the results, it informed me better personally on what we're trying to build.
Yeah, setting aside some assumptions, going in with open eyes and open mind, huh?
Yeah, I mean, especially with audiences and goals, you think that you've got these 2 or 3 core audiences, and then you realize that, oh, we're actually doing lots of targeted reporting on this problem, or we really want to ramp up our advocacy and we really want to target policymakers on the Hill, which wasn't something that we've considered previously. So yeah, I think just broadening the scope of what you're building can only be helped by talking to more people.
Building off of that, another kind of key thing for any user research method is, as Justin mentioned, getting a diversity of your audiences, making sure you have representatives from each of your audience types, and diversity not just in the audience types, but in demographics and also their touch points with you, making sure that you're talking to people that are new to your website or app, and also people that are very familiar with it. Getting a diversity of opinions will make your research that much more powerful.
Yeah. So we are coming to the top of the hour, and I'd love to make sure that we have a little bit of time left over to just set some clear next steps for everybody. So as we move forward into this slide deck, I want to just highlight something that led us both to how this project started, but also how we like to approach anything from a project execution perspective. And that's going to be what we like to call discovery sessions, right? So no client of ours starts a web project without a thorough discovery session, nor do we believe anybody who's running their own project should start without having a very clear understanding what that job to be done is, what the technical requirements are, maybe what the technical environment looks like, and ultimately the objectives that you're looking for. So if you have a web project that you are considering taking on in the future, if you have something that you're in the middle of and you need a little bit of help with, we would love the opportunity to be able to talk to you all about that. That is just something that we truly enjoy being able to do. It gives us the opportunity to continue to learn, sharpen our skills, but also help out people who are looking to do great things through digital means. So if you go online to our website, we have savvislabs.com/discovery session. You can schedule time to talk with one of our team members about your project. Also, if you'd just like to reach out to us directly, info@savvislabs is a great email address for that. And really, I'd love to be able to just close things out by saying thank you. Thank you for taking the time today to sit through our workshop. I know that our entire team here spent a lot of time putting together a lot of really great content to make sure that they could help you better understand some of these research methods, how to approach them, why you should. And hopefully you can take that information alongside the workbook that we provided earlier this week to help you start to put more firm ideas down on how you want to approach your project. So if you have any questions after today's conversation, feel free to reach out to us at info@savvislabs.com. We'll be more than happy to help and push you in the right direction, whether that's resources, whether that's giving you some advice, whether that's putting together a little bit of a direction that we think we could take you within. So we will be following up later this week with today's recording. We will also make sure that you get that workbook sent to you again, just in case you maybe didn't get it that first time or you need a new one to share with somebody else. We are happy to have had you today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next client-side chat.